Hello listeners, my name is Vandana. Welcome to a very special episode of Simple Stories That Touched My Heart. Special not only because the story I'm sharing today happens to be set in my hometown Solon and reminds me of how it used to be years ago in the 80s, but also because the author, Professor Dhruv Nath, happens to be a son of the soil and a proud pahadia as he calls himself in the book. And his account is like a true sketch of my sleepy little hill town. When I chanced upon this book, I was excited, but also a little wary. Because normally how the hill people and stories, especially in our movies, are depicted is stereotypical and caricaturish. So dear listeners, it was a pleasure to discover that the pace, the people, the conversations, the humor and the situations were all familiar. In fact, I could even imagine Mangatram's cheeky smile and twinkling eyes flanked by a web of laughter lines. So if you want a slice of life kind of a peep into a Pahadi small town, come join the fun. Before I tell you the first story of the book, titled The Dining Table, here is how the author introduces his book named Welcome to Arampur. Happy listening. Let's take you to Arampur. Dear reader, welcome to this book, where I will take you to a sleepy little town tucked away in the majestic hills of Himachal. The town is called Arampur. And no, that's not a spelling mistake. It's not Rampur, it's Arampur. What did you say? You haven't been there? You haven't even heard of it? Ah, my friend, you've missed something in life. It's a truly wonderful place. If you happen to live in one of our huge congested cities like Delhi or Mumbai or Bangalore, you must visit Arampur and discover for yourself just how peaceful life in these small towns can be. No massive traffic jams, no pollution, no mad rush to get from one place to another, and no desperation to save those 2 critical minutes. Yes, you must go there. But till you visit Arampur, do read this book. It'll be almost as good as the real thing. But what if you don't have the privilege of living in one of our cities? What if you live in a small town yourself? Well then, do read the book anyway, because in Arampur, you will see your own little town. You will identify with the characters, the college, the club, the events, and just about everything else I've written. And then, of course, you're welcome to visit it. So, this book is about Arampur. But it is also about the inhabitants of this little town. Starting with Mr. P.K. Thakur, popularly known as Kaptan Sahib. As fine a Himachali gentleman as you'll ever meet. And extremely helpful. I'm told that many years ago, he had almost gotten into the Indian army. Which explains why he was called Kaptan Sahib and not Thakur Sahib. Anyhow, after having tried out a few jobs in the city of Delhi, largely in business strategy and marketing, he happened to visit Arampur. One visit and his mind was made up. Other people might have migrated to silly places like the USA or Canada, but Kaptan Sahib was clear. He was going to migrate to Arampur. Along with his family, consisting of his wife, popularly known as Mrs. Kaptan or Madam Kaptan, or if you wanted to save your breath, simply Madam, and 3 children, Manju, Sanju and Panju. But why did he decide to migrate? Simple. He had decided that he didn't want to work for a boss anymore. He would pursue farming in the hills, be his own boss, so to speak. As you might imagine, with a marketing background, he was great at convincing people, and he managed to convince his family to shift to the small town. And so, the entire family moved bag and baggage and set up base in Arampur. But this book is not just about Kaptan Sahib and his family. It's also about other inhabitants of this cute little town. It's about Mangatram, the hard-working carpenter who always took ages to finish any project, leading his customers to tear out their hair in frustration. It's about the Pahalwan Nai and how he transformed himself from a champion wrestler to a barber. It's about the wonderful Dr. Harish Lamba, who came to this town to ply his medical trade. It's about Kaptan Sahib's glamorous cousin, who came to stay with him and turned the male population of the town on its head. It's about so many of these wonderful people. But it's not just about people. It's also about some institutions in Arampur, such as the prestigious Engineering College, the popular Institute of Technology and Science, also called PITS, where Kaptan Sahib's two older children, Manju and Sanju, had the good fortune to get admission. And the famous popular public school, or PPS for short, which the younger son Panju attended. And the extremely classy Arampur Club, which would probably put lesser known clubs such as the Delhi Gymkhana Club to shame. And of course, it's also about events that Arampur is famous for, such as the annual wrestling championship. Perhaps even the Olympics would not get the kind of viewership that this championship did, or the wonderful annual picnic organized by the Arampur Club. But before you start reading this book, since you've bought it, I assume you do plan to read it, I wanted to share a thought. Yes, this book is about a small town in the hills, and if you live in such a town, I'm sure you will identify with Arampur and its proud citizens. But if you live in a large city, just think, isn't there a Kaptan Sahib in your neighborhood? Someone who takes leadership and is always willing to help everyone? Or spare a thought for the barber who gives you a haircut? What's his story? Is it really any different from that of the Pahalwan Nai in Arampur? Or the carpenter who makes the sofas for your plush drawing room in Mumbai and keeps delaying the job? Can't you see a bit of Mangatram in him? Or even the college that you have been to, isn't it remarkably similar to PITS, the engineering college that Arampur boasts of? Yes, my friend, human nature is the same everywhere. Whether you live in Delhi or Chennai or Kolkata or a sleepy little hill town, all you need to do is dig a bit deep and you'll find Arampur wherever you live. One more thing. How do I know so much about life in the hills of Himachal? Simple. I am from Himachal and I've spent a large part of my life in the town of Solan as well as Shimla. And I am as much a proud pahadia as any of the other characters you will meet in the book. Yes, sir. I know small towns in Himachal like the back of my hand. Finally, after reading the book, I'm certain that you would want to visit this little town. And when you do, not if, please get in touch with me. I can actually introduce you to some of the characters that you'll be meeting in this book. And it's just possible that your story will figure in my next book. With that, please turn the page. Let's start with the first story. And I hope you have as much fun reading this book as I had in writing it. The dining table. And now for the first story, where you will meet Kaptan Sahib, who had moved bag and baggage from the busy city of Delhi to the peaceful hill town of Arampur. But you already know all this, so let's move on. Now, before migrating to Arampur, Kaptan Sahib had made an earlier visit to the town and had taken up a cute little house on rent, fully furnished. The house had a sofa set, a couple of small tables, and some built-in cupboards. But the pride of the place went to the dining table with its set of 4 chairs. My God, that dining table was something else. It looked antique and probably was. Kaptan Sahib was told by the landlord that it was made of teak wood. And being the utterly gullible man that he was, he believed it. It's another matter that when his wife saw it, she immediately realized it was definitely not teak. It was probably made from cheap pine wood, which was typically used to make small crates to pack the apples that Himachal was famous for. But she didn't have the heart to tell her husband and kept her silence. Therefore, the teak table stayed on. In fact, it became the star of the household, almost a family member, you might say. There was only one minor issue with the table. It was just a little bit rickety. You see, it had one central leg. That's it. And this leg was not the sturdiest. Even the joint where the leg met the tabletop was not the strongest. And therefore, you can imagine the consequences. If you were to put your elbows on the table, the bowl of dal would come sliding down. Glasses of water had a peculiar habit of ending up on the floor. Rotis, of course, were not an issue. You could simply pick them up from the floor, wipe off the dust and eat them. If some of the dust remained, well, that was just too bad. In any case, the members of the Kaptan family were fit. Their intestines and various other parts of their respective digestive systems were strong, so there was no real problem. The problem was the liquids, the dal, the chicken curry, the soup. Sadly, the family was forced to cut down on their consumption of dal and curries rather than having to clean up the floor every time. Over the next few months, they learned how to eat without keeping their elbows on the table, even when discussing utterly volatile subjects such as the panchayat elections in the neighborhood village of Salarghat. You see, this was a far more important issue than the election of the Prime Minister of the country because their maid lived in this village and the wrong top management could be quite disastrous to the well-being of the Kaptan family. When they did have chicken curry or dal for dinner, they had learned that the heavy bowl needed to be kept close to the center of the table for maximum stability. And over time, with some completely natural casualties, the family became masters at rickety table management. In fact, they even took a certain quiet pride in their expertise. But what about their friends and their relatives who love to come to the hills in summertime? To understand this, let's look at a typical evening at their house. Friend, about to place a bowl of dal close to the edge. Very good dal. Kaptan Sahib shrieking, no, don't! Friend, what happened? Kaptan madam almost shouting, this table tends to shake. Please don't keep the dal there. Friend, completely flustered by now, drops the bowl. Oh no. I'm sure you get the idea. Over time, stories of the dining table became legendary across the length and breadth of Arampur. So much so that whenever they invited friends, the standard response was, why don't we eat at the club instead? And now, dear reader, you can appreciate why the dining table had such a significant impact on the social standing of the family. Obviously, things could not go on like this forever. And one fine day, after the nth bowl slid down and broke, Kaptan Sahib put his foot down. Enough is enough, he said. We are getting a new table. In any case, the amount we spent on crockery so far would have probably gotten us 2 tables. Fortunately, there was consensus around the table. And so the decision was made and written in stone. They would buy a dining table. Period. But how? There was no great furniture shops in Arampur. And the closest option was perhaps Chandigarh, around 80 kilometers away. But here, Kaptan Sahib had one of his regular brainwaves. I know. We'll ask Mangatram to make it. Who's Mangatram? Was the natural question from the family. A friend of mine, said Kaptan Sahib, and a very good carpenter. The second part, of course, was said with a touch of pride as though he was personally responsible for Mangatram's capabilities. Given the plethora of choices, namely one, the family agreed, and Kaptan Sahib went off in search of Mangatram. He found the gentleman in his little shop, relaxing and sipping tea. Both very common occupations among Pahadias, in case you aren't aware of. I should know, being a proud Pahadia myself. Aao Bauji, kaise ho? Saying which, Mangatram promptly organized a second glass of tea for his visitor. After the usual half an hour of chit-chat, the topic veered around the purpose of Kaptan Sahib's visit, which he proceeded to explain. Abhi lo Bauji, bas abhi lo, said Mangatram, hearing which Kaptan Sahib's level of confidence soared as he proceeded to explain his requirements. All through this, of course, Mangatram kept nodding his head, saying, Fikr na karo Bauji, ban jayega. Finally, the deal was clinched over yet another glass of tea. Kaptan Sahib declining the very generous offer of a bidi. The time frame was fixed at 1 week, and Kaptan Sahib left for home, happy in the knowledge that the family would finally have a dal-proof dining table. The week passed quickly, and Kaptan Sahib was back in Mangatram's shop with a glass of tea in his hand, looking around for the table. But of course, it wasn't to be found. बाऊजी, मेरे जीजे के भतीजे की शादी थी, पर आप फिक्र मत करो, बस एक हफ्ता और. And our innocent, gullible Kaptan Sahib agreed. A glass of tea later, and he was on his way home. The family had to go out of town for the next 10 days, but they were quite excited on their return. After all, they would be seeing a brand new table. And without wasting time, Kaptan Sahib went off in search of Mangatram and the promised table. "Kahan hai table?" he asked Mangatram, looking quite confused. "बाऊजी, वो देखो, मैंने लकड़ी खरीद ली, बस एक हफ्ते की बात है." Sure enough, there were a few rough planks of wood kept aside. But now, of course, Kaptan Sahib was getting a bit frustrated. Not too frustrated, mind you, because in the hills, everything proceeds at a leisurely pace and cannot be hurried. No, sir, that would go completely against the grain of any self-respecting pahadia. And Kaptan Sahib was, after all, a pahadia. But a bit of frustration had definitely begun to creep in. However, that was taken care of by the next glass of tea which Mangatram promptly put into his hand, after extracting a solemn promise that the table would be completed by the end of the week. Kaptan Sahib returned home, but he was thinking. A week passed and Kaptan Sahib went back to Mangatram's shop, which was shut. On being questioned, the owner of the shop next door said that Mangatram's wife's fourth cousin's father-in-law had passed away at the untimely age of 97. Naturally, Mangatram had had to go. Where to? He didn't know, but apparently it was a day's journey each way. Kaptan Sahib was boiling when he returned home. The choicest of abuses were hurled at the little flower pot kept in the garden, since the actual recipient was not available. Of course, the poor flower pot chose not to respond, realizing that Sahib was in a towering rage. Anyhow, having given his word to Mangatram, Kaptan Sahib had no choice. So he went back a week later, and this time Mangatram was beaming. "देखो बाऊजी, वो लकड़ी प्लेन करके रखती है, बस कुछ दिन और." Not wanting to be rude, Kaptan Sahib took the proffered glass of tea, but he was seething inside. And when he returned home, his mind was made up. Enough is enough. We go to Chandigarh tomorrow to buy a table. Early next morning, the family made a visit to Chandigarh. They went into the first furniture shop they could find, and of the two ugly-looking pieces on display, selected one. That's it. They were tired and fed up, and the impact of the current table on their social standing was beginning to hurt. And therefore, the next day, Kaptan Sahib's residence boasted of a spanking new dining table, completely dal-proof. A few days later, Kaptan Sahib happened to bump into Mangatram at a tea shop in the market. And boy, was Mangatram excited. "बाऊजी, अब तो मैंने लकड़ी काट भी ली है, बस कुछ दिनों की बात है." Of course, Kaptan Sahib gave him the bitter news. But was Mangatram disappointed? Come on, dear reader, you clearly do not understand Pahadi thinking. "Oh, आपने खरीद ली? चलो कोई बात नहीं, उस लकड़ी का पलंग बना दूंगा. 2 चाय लाना." The last bit, of course, was said to the younger helper in the tea shop. And that was that. But there is more to this story, so please read on. When Kaptan Sahib reached home that day, he was thinking of the time when he used to live in Delhi, the time when he had tried to get a wooden cabinet made for his home, and had tried out 3 different carpenters, with each being more unreliable than the other. While dealing with these gentlemen, Kaptan Sahib had almost torn his hair out in frustration. And perhaps for the first time in this story, Kaptan Sahib smiled. No, he was grinning from ear to ear. Yes, he had migrated from a busy metro to a small sleepy hill town. But things had not really changed. Human nature, that undefinable, completely unpredictable characteristic, was the same everywhere. Finally, there is one last bit that I must tell you. Over the years, Kaptan Sahib moved back to Delhi and took up a job once again. Farming was not really working out, you see. However, he loved going back to Arampur and reliving his days there. During one of these visits, he landed up at Mangatram's shop, but there he got the sad news. Mangatram had passed away, presumably not from overwork. His son, Duniram, was sitting in the shop relaxing. He asked Duniram whether he was a carpenter as well. Duniram shook his head and said, "Nahi, hum chai ka kaam karte hain." Kaptan Sahib looked around, nonplussed. There were no customers, no place to sit except for one broken chair on which Duniram sat, and definitely no sign of any eatables. All it had was one kerosene stove and a couple of pots and pans. In fact, as a business establishment, it reeked of utter failure. But was Duniram unhappy? Of course not. He was quite content to sit on his little chair and wait for customers to come in. If they didn't come in, well, that was just too bad. And that, dear reader, is where Kaptan Sahib had his first lesson in genetics. Mangatram might have left our world, but his genes were going strong. In his son, of course. Thank you for joining me for this charming story. I do hope you enjoyed my version of it. If you did, do consider following the podcast for regular updates. Till the next episode, coming up soon, goodbye and stay inspired.